So you want to learn how to knit and actually make your own clothes, join the Grandma Club, I got you. Now, I'm still quite new to knitting, but I of course share all of my creative passions and journeys with you all. And some of you asked me to do a video on just like a beginner's guide on how to knit, how to learn how to knit, what projects to do, things like that. And I thought I would kind of share my experience as a very beginner knitter, how I've learned, what I've made, what tools I have, things like that. So let's just dive right in. Starting off with my knitting backstory, I have shared this a little bit in some of my past videos, but I'll go over it quickly again. I actually learned how to knit before I learned how to crochet, which is crazy to me because crochet is the thing that I'm most confident in, but knitting was something that my grandma taught me when I was really young, and she just taught me just the basics of how to do it. But I don't know, as a kid, like if you're not really seeing your friends do something, like you're not really gonna get into it. I don't know, it just didn't really stick with me. I kind of knew how to knit a scarf, but I wasn't really interested in continuing it, unfortunately, so that kind of just was that. Fast forward to a few years later, I actually was a very late Harry Potter fan. I didn't start actually liking the movies or reading the books until my like uni days. I don't know, I just never watched it as a kid, but I'm obsessed with it now. And so I wanted to pick knitting back up because I wanted to make a Gryffindor scarf, but again, it didn't really stick. Like I had fun making that scarf, but all I could make was a scarf. I don't really wear scarves in my daily life, so again, it didn't really stick. Fast forward again until this year. I don't really know what it was that made me just suddenly have the urge to knit again, but I just did. I guess like I just seen a lot of my favorite like crochet content creators, influencers also learn to knit, or they'd been making knitting videos for a while, and I just felt like, you know, it was time to learn how to knit again. I also have a really exciting project I'm doing that involves knitting that you guys will hear about. Oh my gosh, if you can see Miso sleeping there, she's doing little puppy sleeping noises. Let me just, one second. That was too cute, I had to show you. Like I was saying, I do have a really exciting knitting project that I've been working on for months that you guys will kind of hear about in the next few months, I promise. I'd always loved the look of knitting. I always wanted to get more into knitting, but to me, it just seemed way too complicated. I don't know why. Because all I learned to make before that was a scarf, like which is pretty much just, you know, a very long rectangle. I just didn't have the concept of like, how do you actually knit clothing? And if you watch my how to crochet video, I kind of talk more there about how I got into crochet, but essentially I just love making clothes. I never really was interested in crocheting or knitting anything that, I don't know, wasn't clothes. I don't know what it is. I just love making clothes, and I feel like crochet really taught me just like the like anatomy, I guess, of clothing. For example, to make like a cardigan, you would do front panels, a back panel, and then 2 sleeves, maybe some like ribbing or whatever, but like essentially that was kind of the formula you would use to make a cardigan. And so once I knew how to do that with crochet, it was kind of easier for me to then relearn how to actually do like knit stitches, and then I kind of just went in and made those exact same kind of shapes or whatever you'd call it that you would make for a jumper, but in a knitted form, if that makes sense. Like I just used the same methodology that I used with crocheting clothing, but I swapped that out with, instead of crocheting it, I like knitted those shapes and then I just like sewed it all together. That's kind of like my very beginner experience. I've not really made a lot with knitting thus far, which is why I haven't really made that many knitting videos, but I'm really loving it. I'm really enjoying it. I love the look of knitting. Like it just looks so good to me. And I am really enjoying it as well. I do still have my love of crochet, don't get me wrong, but I just like that I've been able to pick up another skill and basically just do more with yarn because I have a lot of it and it's just a lot of fun. But yeah, I've been obsessed with knitting, I guess, for the past like 3-4-ish months, and I'm just really enjoying it. So now let's talk about how you can start knitting and what you will need. So let's move on to supplies. Now, the world of knitting and crochet is obviously very similar, it's just the different tools. The thing I loved about crochet was you just use one hook, essentially, whereas with knitting, there's like, obviously the knitting needles, chunky ones, all these different sizes, and then you've got circular needles, and just, to me, this just was really overwhelming, and I was like, I don't even know where to start. Let me talk to you about knitting needles, okay? So I actually started with this kind of set of needles. Now, knitting needles, just like crochet hooks, are pretty inexpensive. They can range, but you can get pretty inexpensive ones. These ones, I think I actually got like a set of all these different sizes from Kmart, and you can also find needles in the thrift store. It's funny because my friend Jasmine actually taught me how to crochet, and now I'm teaching her how to knit. We actually just went thrifting and found a bunch of needles, and she got them, and yeah, you can literally just get needles from anywhere. I did this with crochet as well. I kind of got just one big pack of like all the sizes that you need, and I don't think it's quite necessary to get a whole pack of needles, but honestly, if it comes cheaper in a pack, like it's obviously better value. I would just kind of figure out the first project you want to make, which we will talk about what you should make as your first project. And say you're following a pattern or whatever it is, or you've already bought yarn, I would just get the knitting needle size that you need for that first project, and then you can kind of build up your knitting needle collection as you go. Now I guess we can talk about the difference between just straight stick knitting needles and a circular needle. These are from one of my favorite brands to shop from. It's a small business here in Australia, and they also sell yarn called Knitato. Something about knitting with like wooden needles just feels so good. Most of you will have seen this kind of knitting needle, just a straight long knitting needle. To me though, I really do prefer circular needles. They're just so much easier. It's less bulky. It's obviously got this thing attaching the two needles, which means you can then work in the round, and working in the round, especially for sleeves or things like that, just makes it so much easier rather than having to just like knit full panels with this. It's also just so much easier to knit with this, like just like with these, I mean these are obviously really chunky needles. These are both 15mm needles, so for very chunky yarn. Even with this, like it's just so bulky and chunky here to like knit with these. I mean, this is not how you knit, but you know what I mean, like it's just so chunky, whereas with something like this, it's just so much smaller and you don't have like long needles going everywhere. It's just so much better to knit with, so much easier, so much less hassle. These are easier to like throw in a bag and take your knitting with you. I just am such a big fan of a circular knitting needle. It's completely up to you, whatever you prefer. This is just my kind of preference. I started knitting with chunkier yarn, which I think as well is a really great way as a beginner to learn, because it is chunkier, it's easier to see what you're doing and the actual stitches, and if you drop a stitch or whatever, it's just easier to see the actual stitch, and also a lot faster to work up a project. For me as well, I think the thing that made me not stick with knitting the first kind of 2 times I learnt was I was knitting a scarf, I was knitting on like straight needles, and I was knitting like just, you know, smaller size yarn, so it took so much longer and I just got bored of it so much quicker, whereas bigger needles, circular needles, just made things go easier. So yeah, I started with these 12mm, and then I also got a 15mm, and then I got these wooden ones. I just kind of worked up my collection and bought as I kind of thought to buy it, instead of buying like a whole big pack. But in saying that, I did end up getting a pack of circular knitting needles from Amazon. So this is the pack that I got, and I'll link all my knitting supplies and everything I talk about in this video in the description box. There are a few sizes missing because I'm using them for projects currently, but it literally just comes with all of these different sizes. These are called interchangeable circular knitting needles, and they're just really great because you can travel with a whole bunch of different sizes to just interchange the different sizes that you need. For other supplies, there's not actually much else you need that's different from crochet. So similar things that you would need would be scissors, measuring tape, stitch markers, and obviously yarn, which we'll talk about. I'm not going to talk too much about yarn because I talked a lot about it in my how to crochet video, but essentially the main yarns that you would hear of people using are acrylic yarn. That's just the most accessible, the most affordable, but also the least sustainable. You have mohair yarn. My favorite to use is chunky merino wool. This is kind of what I use for my first project. It's just super fun and works up really quickly because it is chunkier. For me as well with knitting, because I am a beginner at it, I am a lot slower at it than I am with crochet, because obviously I'm way more confident with crochet. I also just think knitting in general takes longer, but having chunky merino wool yarn just makes my knitting projects go a lot quicker because it is chunkier. A thing to note with knitting as well, I do believe it uses more yarn than a crochet project would. Those are the more like essential supplies. Now for ones that aren't as essential but I think are great, I kind of mentioned these as well in my how to crochet video, so if you want to know more about these, go watch that, but also these will be linked on my Amazon storefront. A yarn winder, very useful. I have a whole video showing you how to use a yarn winder. They're so handy. I would also recommend a little like yarn holder bag. I showed you this again in my crochet video. It's so handy. I currently have a knitting project in there, and it's just so handy to take knitting with you on the go. Some different supplies that you might need for knitting and not for crochet. I mean, you could probably use these for crochet as well. I've not used these before, but I have seen other people use them, so I thought I'd talk about them. But it is a thing in the knitting community to block your knits, which basically just is a process of reshaping your knits. It involves like washing your knit, using like blocking squares and pins or whatever to kind of lay out your project, to kind of reshape it. Maybe you want it bigger, you want it to fit a different way. I've not done it, like I said, so I can't really talk much about it, but I know that people do it. If you're making clothing, it might be useful to you, so I thought I'd mention it. You can go look into it more if that's something you're interested in. Something else I've seen people use are a steamer and a shaver. I actually do have both of these, but I've not used them on any of my knitting projects so far. But again, I've seen people use these and they seem really useful. So those are all of the supplies that you will need to knit. One thing I wanted to talk to you about is gauge swatches. I'm talking to you about this before I talk about like projects or figuring out what to actually make, because I feel like it's a great thing to start with. It's definitely not something that I actually do, but this is more of a do what I say, not what I do type thing. Gauge swatches are really, really great, especially when deciding how much yarn you need or what kind of project you're going to do, things like that. So a gauge swatch essentially is just a little swatch of yarn that you would knit up to kind of get your gauge, which essentially means like if you're following a pattern or if you're trying to figure out how many stitches to cast on based on how big you want a project to be for different sizes, especially if you're reading a pattern that someone else has written. It's great to do a gauge swatch because there are a lot of different factors that go into how this pattern is written or whatever. Everyone knits with different tension. The way you knit 10 stitches may be a different size or measurement to how the pattern writer knit 10 stitches. You also may be using different needles or different yarn size or things like that. It's just great to get a swatch or a gauge on how big turn out with your kind of knitting style. If you look at a yarn label, which all of them have this, and I talk more about how to actually read a yarn label again in my how to crochet video. You can see here, this is for my chunky merino wool, that it shows a little grid here. 9 rows by 7 stitches will give you a 10 by 10 centimeter square, and it also shows you the recommended needle size that you can use as well. So that is kind of like a mini gauge that you can use. That is something I recommend. Again, I will leave any videos on gauge swatches, how to do them, and a better explanation in the description. I definitely think that's something to look into. As for the main stitches that I think that you need to learn, obviously the first is casting on. There are so many different ways to do this, which is a little bit confusing. I mainly do a long tail cast on. Don't know if this is the easiest to do. It's just the first one I learned. It's the only one that I've learned, so that's the one that I do. But honestly, just go onto YouTube. YouTube is the best place to learn things. I would then also learn obviously the knit stitch. That's, you know, it's knitting, you want to learn the knit stitch, and then the purl stitch as well. And doing a combination of the knit and the purl stitch, basically all I do. I only ever use those. I don't know any other stitches, like those are all I know how to do. Basically on any clothing that you've ever worn that is knit has those 2 stitches. It's called a stockinette stitch when they're together. To do a stockinette stitch, you do 1 row of knits and then 1 row of purls, and it kind of creates that V shape that you see in, again, all of your like professionally knitted clothing. And once you know how to do a knit and a purl as well, then you know how to do ribbing, which ribbing basically you can do like 1 by 1 ribs or 2 by 2 ribs. Essentially ribbing involves a knit stitch and then a purl and the knit and a purl and knit and a purl, and that gives you kind of like a ribbed effect. So yeah, learning knit and then learning how to purl means you can basically do anything. That's basically all you need to learn. After that, learning how to cast off your project, obviously to get the project off of your needles. That is something that is super different with crocheting. Like with crochet, the project doesn't need to be on the needle, but with knitting, the project gets casted onto the needle. You work your project up and then you cast it off the needle. Yeah, obviously learning a cast off is great because you don't want to just have your knitting needles stuck to your project forever. From there, I learned how to decrease and increase. I learned how to shape a neck hole to do a V-neck. I basically just learned things as I wanted to do them, if that makes sense. Like, I wouldn't stress yourself and try and learn everything all at once because that's just too overwhelming. I would keep it super simple and just learn the stitches you need as you go. Okay, so now that you know what supplies you need, the gauge, and what stitches that you should learn. Now we can talk about patterns and what your first project should actually be. So my first project with knitting, like I said, was scarves. They are super easy to knit. Obviously it's just like a really long rectangle, so it's just a really good one to just really solidify your skills. If you wanted to do like the stockinette stitch, you could just do knits and purls all the way up, and that's it. There's no increases, decreases. You obviously need to cast on and cast off, so it's a really great one if you're a beginner to just really learn the basics of knitting. I do recommend that as your first project, even though to me it's quite boring because it's just like really long. You could even learn to maybe make like a stripy scarf, so you can learn to like change colors whilst knitting out the scarf, because then that's a little bit more interesting. Or you can just stick to one color if you really just want to nail down the basics. But I do think a scarf, I mean, I feel like it's everyone's first project, and it's for a good reason. It's because it's so easy. For me though, my kind of, I guess, first project, as I picked up knitting recently, I made a sweater vest. Again, it's really annoying, but I didn't follow a pattern or anything. Like I said, I just kind of transferred my knowledge of crochet and like used it for knitting. So I kind of just guessed how many stitches to cast on and just what to do. And I just made like 2 panels, the front and a back, and then sewed them together, and that made a vest. It was really easy. I spend my life just watching crochet and knitting influencers and YouTubers, so that by the time I get to actually knitting or crocheting a thing, I've watched so many people do this one thing that like I kind of just already know how to do it, if that makes sense. It's really weird. Like obviously I will look up like tutorials and stuff when I need them, but like I had just watched so many people knit a sweater vest, and kind of just like when it came to me actually doing it, I just did it essentially. Obviously there are so many great videos out there that can teach you how to knit. I also have a video on how to make a scrap yarn sweater vest, which is essentially, yeah, what my first project was. If you want to see how to make that, then I'll link that in the description and in the cards. Yeah, a sweater vest is a really easy and quick one to do as well. Obviously it doesn't take as much time as like a full-on like sweater with like sleeves and everything. There are also a bunch of free patterns that you can get on places like Cardigan, Wool and the Gang, Hobie, Love Crafts. There are a bunch of places to get free and also paid patterns. Etsy is a great place to get free and paid patterns too, especially by like creators and smaller creators and things like that. Etsy is great. I actually haven't used a knitted pattern yet. I actually don't know how to read knitted patterns yet, because obviously all the abbreviations and things, but I will learn one day. There's actually a few patterns that I have like open on my computer that I just need to like download and start learning. Yeah, for me, when I'd like to learn things, I literally just consume so much content of that thing. By the time I get to actually doing it, I kind of already have an idea in my head of like how to do it and how to start. And I love just freehanding things. I love just like figuring out how to do a thing. If I make a mistake, then like you just learn how to fix that, and I think that's a great way to do it as well. But yeah, in saying that, if you need any ideas, I will have patterns linked down below, as well as some of my favorite creators and YouTubers who have great videos that you can watch that might inspire you as well. They've definitely inspired me. There's a lot of knitting YouTubers I follow. Again, I will link them down below. Like I said, crochet and knitting YouTubers are literally all I watch. Like it's all I consume, so there's a lot of people that I watch, but I'll link some of my favorites down below. So that brings us to the end of this video. Honestly, I've been talking for almost an hour now, so I hope I can edit this down into not too long of a video. But honestly, crochet and knitting are my life. I am like pure grandma in my blood, and it's all I do, so I could talk about it forever and ever. But I hope that this was helpful to you. I hope it was helpful for all beginners out there. Like I said, I am still quite a beginner myself. Like it's only been a couple of months since I fully got into knitting, so I don't have a lot of experience or too many tips to help you with, but these are just everything that I thought was helpful as a beginner. More knitting videos to come. Honestly, I love knitting. It just takes a bit longer for me than crochet does, so I don't do it as often. But if you want more knitting videos from me, I will definitely try and do maybe some smaller projects. Or I did get a comment recently of someone asking me what are some really great like quick knitting projects to do, and honestly I don't know because knitting takes, or at least it takes me so long that I don't know of any quick projects. Honestly, I'm not the best person to ask about quick projects because all I've made so far are sweater vests and like sweaters and things like that. As I keep learning to knit and as I keep, you know, making more projects, of course I will talk to you guys about them. I'm right at the beginning of my knitting journey, and if you guys are at the beginning of yours, I'm really excited for you. I hope you love it as much as I do and stick with it. Yeah, if you're beginning knitting as well, please let me know in the comments down below what you're thinking of making. If you have any first project ideas, let me know. I'd love to talk to you guys all about knitting and things like that. Yeah, I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you guys would like another video like this, maybe on the knitting machine, because I know probably like 90% of my subscribers subscribe to me because of my knitting machine videos. So if you would like a kind of beginner's 101 guide to using the Centro knitting machine, I'd be happy to do that, because I honestly get questions about it every single day. So maybe that is something I'll do if you guys want that. But I just honestly wanted to talk about like hand just crochet and knitting, because those are my loves, those are what I enjoy, and those are what I do more often. Go watch my crochet video as well if you guys maybe want to learn to crochet. Crocheting is fun too, and it's very similar to knitting. All the supplies you would need, other than obviously knitting needles, are the same with crochet. You just need crochet hooks. So I think it's pretty cool to be able to learn both. So yeah, if you're interested in that, then go ahead and watch that, and subscribe to my channel if you guys love crafting and want to join the fellow grandmas like myself. Come join the family, subscribe to my channel. Also follow me on my other socials. I'm on TikTok and Instagram. And yeah, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to me ramble on and on about knitting. I hope it was helpful to you. I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, I appreciate you for being here, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye!